Hi, my name is Christina, and this is my take on teaching and learning online. This video is comprised of, there's two parts to my take. This first part is where I lay out my theoretical understandings of digital spaces and digital practices and how they can be appropriated for learning in a higher education context. In the second video, I will be outlining some examples and providing some ideas of how we can link theory to practice, which in this case also means to transfer practices from informal digital spaces into digital learning environments. I will start by considering the current state of digital practices. In the last 20 years, we have gone through a massive transformation of the digital world, and that has shaped our relationship with information in that we've moved from being mere consumers of information to also being producers of knowledge. So we now coexist into these two different spaces that the web provides us, and we kind of individuals can have multiple roles as part of their digital engagement. This also has meant that literacy, the understanding of literacy, has increased to also incorporate understandings of media and how media shapes our engagement with different forms of text, including visual text and audio forms of communication. And also probably what's been quite interesting to realize in the last decades has been the relationship that we have established with technology, in that is not just something that we use once in a while, but it's something that has become part of who we are and how we engage with the world. So it's become more of a habit of having technology at our disposal. And this then has allowed us to perceive this digital world as part of our own worlds rather than a separate world. And I think these are aspects that are very important to consider when considering what we do and how we organize our teaching and learning online, because students also bring with them these types of perceptions and activities, many times embodied in what they do rather than explicitly reflecting what they could do. And I think that's an important aspect to consider, that our engagement with digital technology is tacit, it kind of, and it's implicit to what we are and what we do. It's also important to also consider and make sense of this digital culture that has been emerging in online spaces. These are practices that are embedded into an emergent digital culture that, according to Harry Jenkins, who has conceptualized digital cultures, is underpinned by four elements that are essential to understanding what type of practices can be enacted in online learning spaces. So Jenkins talks about the idea of creation of content and sharing of information as a key aspect of being part of the online world. Related to that is this idea of that contribution matters. And what this means is that participation needs to be visible so that people can mark their presence online. So contribution becomes a great form to initiate that kind of presence online. And it's also a way to also foster new connections. And so Jenkins also talks about this idea of social connections being key to this current digital culture that we're witnessing in the online spaces we move about. So this idea of fostering social networks being key for our learning and development. And lastly, it talks about mentorship, this idea that different people with different types of knowledge and expertise coexist in these online spaces, and they pass on knowledges and model behavior in those spaces. So I think these are quite interesting and pertinent aspects and principles to consider when we are organizing our curriculum for online learning. As part of that, he also talks about 4 forms of online participation, including social affiliations, so networking, social networking being a key aspect of online participation as part of the digital cultures. He also talks about this idea of creative expressions, of how people are able to not only organize information and repurpose information, but also to create their own into different types of spaces, such as websites and blogs and photo stories. So that creative expression, that form of creating different forms of knowledge can take on very different shapes. He also talks about that online participation many times relies on collaboration and collaborative endeavors that again bring together people. So social congregation is a key aspect to collaborative work. And finally, he talks about circulation, so creating new media flows through the way that we share content and knowledge. So just another way to explain the 4 elements of digital cultures and how they actually are materialized in effective practice. Alongside these digital practices, individuals are also developing different types of literacies that are key to their engagement and participation online. And usually we talk about more instrumental types of digital literacies. These are probably the ones that come to mind first of all. How do we kind of enable access to online spaces? How can individuals navigate those spaces, make use of different tools, and gather information in critical ways? And those, we could say that they are more on the instrumental side. What I would also like to argue is for a type of literacy that are more on the cultural side of online engagement. So thinking about communicative and cultural practices. And here I draw on the work of Jürgen Habermas, and thinking about how through digital participation and digital practices, we also come to form different communicative competences that allows us to enter this digital cultural space. And from this perspective, the web can then be regarded and repurposed as an intersubjective shared space. And I think this is where things start to get interesting when it comes to us starting to conceptualize what we want to do online as part of our teaching and learning strategy. So from an Habermasian point of view, we would then say that the online world invites forms of communicative action in which teaching and learning is recognized as a multiple or a multi-way dialogue process that values the reasoned voices of all of those involved in the learning process, and that the communicative process should recognize not only the knowledge content of learning, but also the social and personal aspects that enable it. Hence, in online spaces, just like in face-to-face scenarios, negotiated meaning should be core to the teaching and learning strategy that we put in place. Negotiated meaning should be encouraged through reason, justifications, and arguments as a form of promoting learning experiences. Underpinned by understanding of social justice. And what I mean here is that everyone taking part in these learning experiences can and should exercise their voices in informed ways. And that is something that we could try to make more explicit as part of our expectations of what we set our learning environment to be. This then takes us to consider the identities and roles of both educators and learners when they are online. Digital learning practices asks for more dynamic approaches to teaching and learning and spreads the responsibilities of teaching and learning more evenly. In other words, roles are no longer divided into educators as knowledge producers and learners as recipients of information. And this was probably never never your take on education. But what I'm trying to propose here is that we more explicitly move away from a banking education model as criticized or critiqued by Paulo Freire, and that is often associated with online learning. This means that online educators become more concerned with the engineering of learning contexts rather than learning content. In this vein, educators' essential role is then that of animating the learning environment by inviting students to accept and take part in the challenges that educators pose as part of the learning environment. On the other hand, learners are also invited to take responsibility for their learning in different ways. This includes that taking and using their 300 hours or 200 hours that usually is associated with independent work in more active ways and in a more constant way, and using their learning time to prepare to contribute to class. So seeing class time, be it synchronously or asynchronously, as moments where and opportunities where students can contribute to the knowledge that is fostered in that environment. And this is key so that students are able to develop visible learning routines, as online presence is mostly manifested through active contributions and through participation that can be made visible through the spaces in which students will congregate and come together. And the final aspect that I think is very important, it's something that will be learned along the way. It's not something that probably will come already with all the skills required, but it's this idea that we need to learn how to be in online spaces, and especially from an intellectual work perspective. This is also a key aspect to be part of the digital learning environment in a more not only effective way, but in a more satisfying way. And I think this is one of the aspects that we need to target at or aim at, is to think about how can we derive some aspect of making these spaces meaningful to everyone involved. And what that requires is everyone's investment in their relationship with that space and with also the people involved. So here brings me, this aspect brings me then to think about what learning ethos should be developed online. And here what we can say is that I've tried to kind of group it into 4 key elements that I think are essential to developing a learning ethos and how we should communicate that to all the parties involved. One aspect that is key to online learning is the understanding that this is a relationship of interdependence, in the sense that we're depending on each other for the sharing of knowledge and to the construction of critical understandings. And so online learning is pretty much dependent on different forms of collaboration, either by contributing to other people's knowledge, by commenting on what people are doing, but also by participating in different ways that allows to foster shared understandings. And this comes with acts, or what I will call acts of generosity, in the sense that we are reliant online on this spirit of sharing that is evidenced through learners' contributions in the way in which people can share knowledge and contribute to debates that are instigated by the class in which they take part. Additionally to that, it's important to develop and to foster an environment that is dynamic enough to take into account and to welcome different forms of participation. And here there's a reliance also not only on educators to foster those environments, but also on students to have the motivation to do so. And this leads me to the last point that I want to make in terms of the ethos of the class, which is the transformative aspect of learning, which is very important here and it's important everywhere. And as we sometimes say, you know, we usually can only get out what we put in, and this couldn't be, you know, more true in this situation. There has to be a genuine interest in learning and a commitment to developing common knowledge. These are key ingredients to the transformative aspect of learning, and especially evident in online learning. So here what I want to communicate is that in online learning environments, the responsibility for a meaningful and satisfying experience rests with all the stakeholders involved. And here when I mean satisfying is not in the sense of satisfaction rates, but rather of how we feel fulfilled in terms of what we've learned and how we feel that it has transformed our views and our practices. And I will not shy away from saying that this is hard work, but it's worth fighting for it or to work on it. But it's hard work for all parties involved, and it requires everyone to make an effort to be part of that spirit and of that environment, so that they can actually feel the benefits. So basically, what I'm trying to propose here is that online learning aims to follow Paulo Freire's lead in transforming transfers of information into real acts of knowing. And these real acts of knowing can be fully realized through different forms of participation that can add meaning to what people are learning. And I think these are important messages to take on board. So in short, online learning, from my perspective, asks for a great emphasis or a greater emphasis on the developing of learning contexts rather than just learning content, as context allows the content to emerge and to be derived from learners' participations and contribution. So this allows us to make a case for learning as a key social practice, and seeing digital technologies as enablers of spaces that can house such type of activities. So I'll end here, and thank you so much for allowing me to share my ideas.